Perhaps I should talk about something not so scary. Nah, can't do it. Volcano time! When we had last left the Olympic-Wallowa Lineament, or OWL, we just learned that there are several different surface faults here in western Washington. From the North Olympic Fault Zone to Whidbey Island, Seattle, Tacoma, White River, so on and so forth, there are several faults that are in our area that are capable of producing some decent-sized earthquakes. And all of those faults stem from the impact of the rocks that make the Olympic Mountains. But as OWL passes through North Bend, we enter the Cascade Range, which has a very different story than all of those faults back in the Puget Basin. I'm just gonna come out and say it. If you've driven I-90 east or westbound, you've driven through a volcano. To be fair, that's not as uncommon as you'd think, but I'm working on a technicality. As you can imagine, a massive amount of rock that extends from southern Oregon to Vancouver Island causes a lot of damage upon impact. Before the chaos of Silencia, there was a large oceanic plate known as the Farallon Plate. Farallon filled a significant portion of the Pacific Ocean. It was the proto-plate. But through common plate tectonics, the Pacific Plate was born and started to push out from its point of origin. And in our area, Farallon was being subducted. So as Farallon's being pushed and then subducted, take a very large amount of material and jam it in that part that's being subducted. Map not to scale. This is a very basic rendition of what's going on. On this side, you have the Farallon Plate being subducted under the North American Plate down to our mantle. Now take a gargantuan amount of material and stick it on top, and chaos reigns. But something really curious happens here. That amount of material entering that specific zone acts as a wedge. And when you take a ton of material here on a pretty weakened joint here, it starts to bend the underside of it until snap. You don't need to be a geophysicist to know that breaking a tectonic plate is probably a bad. When that plate snapped, it left a sort of gap in between the plates. Not like a hole, if you will, but a hole, if you will. This is potentially the source for volcanism in Idaho, Montana, Wyoming, Oregon, and Washington, but story for another day. But after the impact of the Olympics, Silencia, things quiet down for a little while. 10-ish million years. Not to say things were completely quiet, foreshadowing for the next video. Only a small part of Farallon was left at this point in time, which we now know today as the Juan de Fuca Plate. And despite being a little baby in comparison, the Pacific Plate is still pushing behind it. Juan de Fuca was still following Farallon down. Between 40 to 35-ish million years ago, Juan de Fuca reached a depth where it was finally able to full-on melt and bring molten rock to the surface to produce our volcanoes. And it's due to this process that we are so honored to be able to see these volcanoes and their story today. But just because the Cascade Range is that old does not mean our volcanoes are that old. Mount Rainier, Tahoma, is roughly 500,000. Mount Baker, Comocolchen, is roughly about 1.1 million. And the feisty rascal, Mount St. Helens, Blewett, Lawi Latka, only about 40,000. Most volcanoes in the Cascade Range only have a lifespan of about 2 million years. So think about that for a second. If Mount Rainier is 500,000 years old, divide that by 35 million, you have a potential of 70 plus Mount Rainiers. So OWL runs through these ancient volcanic zones in a place that's called a batholith. These are the exposed guts, the plumbing of old volcanoes. OWL cuts right through the Snoqualmie batholith, right along Stampede Pass, which is over in this area here, but nonetheless, this is a gigantic volcanic unit from roughly 20 million years ago. The granites we see up there are exposed due to that 20 million years of erosion. You may, of course, be asking yourself, do we have a batholith today, given our volcanoes? The answer to that question is yes, the Spirit Lake batholith, which sits underneath Mount St. Helens, Mount Rainier, and Mount Adams Klickitat. I did a video about a year ago about all of this to describe how one of these mountains is a little feisty because of this. But hey, almost a 5K followers, so soon it's going to be easier for me to put it in a playlist. Allegedly. But Geology 101 reminds us that when something cuts through an already pre-established unit, it's probably younger. I mean, how would you see it if the older piece came first before the newer piece? But for you keen-eared folks, you may have remembered that I said things settled down-ish for about 10 million years after the impact of the Olympics. But that does not mean things were silent. While we are still headed to the southeast on OWL, we have to take a slight diversion to the north. A whole other fault that is a part of this story. In the next video, I'm going to introduce to you an ancient fault, the Straight Creek Fraser Fault, which runs from Snoqualmie Pass all the way up into Canada. I promise, this one's not that scary.